Canada's premiers are poised to sign an agreement to fast-track new oil sands pipelines, but that could come at the expense of commitments to fight climate change. 3 years in the making, the Canadian Energy Strategy is an ambitious vision of the future of Canada's oil, natural gas and electricity industries. It's set to be unveiled at the Premier's Conference on Wednesday. The plan would commit the provinces and territories to getting more pipelines built by cutting down on red tape and streamlining regulatory decisions. The strategy contains few firm commitments on battling global warming. Energy East, Kinder Morgan, Northern Gateway and Keystone XL pipelines all face stiff opposition from environmental groups and First Nations. The agreement will come at a time of low crude prices, oil sands production cuts, and rising layoffs in the energy sector. Time for E Squared. Tom Rand is the Senior Advisor of Mars Clean Tech. Ken Green, Senior Director at the Centre for Natural Resources at the Fraser Institute. Tom, so let's start with, I think the idea of the premiers coming together and having some vision of our national energy strategy is a good thing, because we don't really have one and it tends to be piecemeal. Does what you're hearing make you nervous that something's getting lost?
Well, climate's constantly getting lost, but I'm very curious as to the results of these discussions. I mean, you've seen premiers Couillard and Wynne step up last week, speaking to international audiences on climate at the Climate Summit in Toronto. So subnational jurisdictions are clearly looking to take the lead. Here it's a domestic audience, obviously, but the pipelines are interesting because that's where all the political rhetoric ultimately must meet pragmatic action. Right. I mean, these are 50-year high carbon infrastructure that enable very high emissions to come from Alberta. And it's increasingly obvious to anybody observing the situation that Canada will not have a hope of meeting targets it commits to if we double production in Alberta. And that's what these pipelines are designed to do, is double production. So it really is a rock and a hard place. And I'm very curious to see how this plays out amongst the premiers, because you have some real climate hawks in there, right? Wynne is a climate hawk, and Energy East has to pass through Ontario and Quebec. Right. So it'll be interesting. Anyway, I'll let it go at that for now.
Okay, so Ken, over to you. Do you agree that there is a potentially good discussion that could come out of this?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we know several things, right? We know that Canada's exports are we're planning to double Canada's exports. The American market, where the overwhelming majority or almost all of our oil goes and gas goes, is shrinking. And so without that new infrastructure, you're going to have curtailed energy exports and curtailed economic growth. We know that, right? So as Tom said, at a certain point, you have to be pragmatic about this and either build the infrastructure that's necessary or somehow resign yourself to a future lack of economic growth. With regard to the whole greenhouse gas targets thing, what we have here, as we've discussed before, is not a failure to achieve a target. It's a failure of setting the proper target. When I was 13, I had a growth goal of 6'4". I topped out at 5'10". It wasn't a failure of growth. It was a failure of vision. So that's the problem with these arbitrary targets and timelines, is that politicians pick them because it makes them feel good and gives them a lift in the polls, and chances are they won't be around to actually have to see them fail and be clawed back.
So there's no question that there's a lot of political hot air around this issue. There has been for a long time. But targets aren't arbitrary, right? The IEA, the IPCC, we're trying to keep it at 2 degrees. We know that these are science-driven targets. So they're not arbitrary. Now, they're very difficult to do. There's no question about that. And that's why people have been avoiding this issue for a very, very long time. You can't square that circle. You can't double Alberta production and have Canada meet any kind of commitment. So what's really going to be interesting is what you have Ontario with a cap and trade. A lot of political will and effort being put into cap and trade, joining California, going down to Paris. Very big agenda there. Whether we meet it or not, I agree with Ken, it's tough. You're going to impose on Ontario industry the obligation to reduce. And then those CEOs and investors and business leaders will look to their cousins in Alberta and say, all the effort I'm making is swamped by your right to double production. Right. So I think within the business community, there's going to be some loggerheads there too. So not just feds and provinces politically, but you're going to see some industries looking at others and saying, look, I'm doing my part. Why are you getting a free pass?
Well, I think also some industries are going to say sayonara. They're going to say, your costs have driven up energy costs to the highest in North America. You're making it increasingly hard to do business in this province or other places to go. And I think that's as real a possibility as having them yell at Alberta is having them come to Alberta.
Well, that's also, so that's why cap and trade is a method of going past the easy cuts, because you can hunt globally for lowest cost reduction. But don't forget, fast track does not necessarily mean fast track to approval. Right? Ontario and Quebec have both set explicitly and formally that greenhouse gas emissions and those pipelines enabling greenhouse gas emissions will be part of the decision process. And Energy East by itself will enable upstream the equivalent emissions of all of Ontario's cars.
Right. There's another piece of this that I want you guys to weigh in, and that is that the provinces can get together and say, let's streamline, let's cut down red tape, and heavens knows, anytime there's a process like this, you probably could reduce the red tape and streamline it for sure. But there's still First Nations, and the rights of First Nations are not getting weaker in this country. They're getting stronger with every single court decision we have. And so, Ken, I don't know, it seems to me there could come a time when it isn't the provinces that have to agree on this stuff, and they're kind of putting First Nations at the end of the list of consultation here.
Well, you can look at it at the end of the list or the top of the heap, depending on how the power situation shakes out. I think you're absolutely right, and Tom is also correct in this, which is streamlined just means faster and more efficient. It doesn't actually say you go or don't go. And there's court challenges, there's environmental group pressures, there's First Nations issues. So this is by no means a speedy resolution or a one and done kind of thing. It's simply an admission that it's better to have efficient regulatory processes than to be at each other's throats all the time on trans-border infrastructure. And
you'll notice in the report that in the Globe today, where they talked about some of the content of those memos, the big point of disagreement is absolute cuts, right? So they're right up against, here's a rock, here's a hard place, how are we going to work it out?
So we don't have a ton of time, 30 seconds each on this one, but there's also a report that suggests that we are failing miserably in this country to meet land preservation goals, that there's been kind of global consensus that countries need to do this, and we are not doing it. How does that square with how we think of ourselves even?
Yeah, I mean, don't commit to something if you're not going to do it. That was my first advice to the federal government. But I, for one, for example, I think that there are certain things in this world, like natural capital, that sit outside standard economic frameworks, and you can't put I'm not saying it's an infinite value, I'm saying it's orthogonal, and it's not captured in standard economic language. And I think that's why things like regulatory protection of marine or land spaces, it needs to be done through a regulatory effort rather than an economic effort.
Ken?
Well, I think what's